On February 20, 2026, the Supreme Court ruled 6-3 that the President of the United States had no legal authority to impose the tariffs he'd been running his entire trade policy through for the previous year. Footnote 1. Chief Justice Roberts wrote the opinion himself. The reasoning was almost elegant in how narrow it was. The emergency powers statute the administration had leaned on lets a president regulate or prohibit imports. But a tariff, the court found, is different in kind, not degree, from an outright ban. Footnote 2. Regulating isn't taxing. Within days, every tariff built on that authority, on Canada, Mexico, China, and most of the rest of the world, was gone. Footnote 3. If you stopped reading the news there, you'd assume that was the end of it. It wasn't. 5 months later, functionally the same tariff wall is back, just held up by 4 different pieces of legislation instead of one, including a provision from 1930 that hadn't been used for anything in roughly 90 years and that a White House lawyer would have needed a law library card to even find. Footnote 4. This isn't a story about whether tariffs are good policy. It's a story about what happens when a government has spent a century quietly stockpiling more ways to do the same thing than anyone remembered it had. Start with what actually got struck down, because the tariffs were illegal undersells how specific the ruling was. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, IEPA, lets a president declare a national emergency over some foreign threat and then regulate transactions connected to it. Footnote 5. No president had ever used it to impose a tariff before 2025. Trump used it twice. Once in February 2025, declaring an emergency over drug trafficking from Canada, Mexico, and China, and again in April 2025, declaring a second emergency over the trade deficit itself. Footnote 6. Both declarations produced tariffs. Both were challenged. Both went all the way to the Supreme Court, consolidated into a single case. Learning Resources Incorporated v. Trump argued that November, decided that February. Footnote 7. The court's holding in the end turned on a fairly narrow textual point. IEPA's authority to regulate importation of goods does not include the power to tax that importation, because a tariff is a different tool entirely from a prohibition. Footnote 2. By February 24, every IEPA tariff had been formally terminated by executive order, and Customs stopped collecting them at midnight. Footnote 3. The court left the question of refunding what had already been collected, a genuinely enormous sum, given the tariffs had been running for the better part of a year, to the lower courts, where it remains unresolved as of this session. Footnote 8. Here's the part that matters more than the ruling itself. The opinion didn't touch 2 other tariff authorities the administration was already using in parallel. Section 232 National Security Tariffs, steel, aluminum, autos, and the chip tariffs this show covered directly last episode, and Section 301 Unfair Trade Practice Tariffs. Footnote 9. Those kept running the entire time, untouched by the ruling because they'd never depended on IEPA in the first place. So the administration didn't need to invent a workaround from scratch. It needed to move fast enough to bridge the gap before anyone noticed how large the gap actually was. It used Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974, a genuinely obscure, deliberately narrow provision that lets a president impose a flat national emergency tariff, capped at 15%, for a maximum of 150 days, no investigation required, as a stopgap, holding a temporary global rate at 10% while something more durable got built. Footnote 10. That clock ran out on July 24, 2026. The same day, new Section 301 tariffs, this time justified not by trade deficits but by a forced labor enforcement finding, took effect on 60 economies accounting for roughly 99% of everything the U.S. imports, at rates of 10 or 12.5% depending on each country's own labor enforcement record. Footnote 11. The investigation behind that finding had opened back in March, concluded in June, and landed the tariffs the exact week the Section 122 bridge expired, a timeline too clean to read as coincidence. Footnote 12. And 4 days before that, on July 20th, the administration reached even further back. Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a provision that had sat completely unused for tariff purposes since the 1930s and 40s, with no confirmed prior use of any kind, was invoked for the first time in the statute's 96-year history, imposing a 50% tariff on roughly $20 billion of Canadian goods, over disputes involving auto tariffs, provincial liquor rules, and dairy quotas. Footnote 4. Trade lawyers have taken to calling it the nuclear option, for a specific, unglamorous reason. Unlike Section 301 or Section 232, Section 338 requires no investigation and no formal finding at all. The President can simply proclaim it. Footnote 13. 4 statutes, 1 struck down in 5 months, Ep. dead, Section 122, a 150-day bridge already expired, Section 301 now the primary vehicle, and Section 338, untested, first ever use, currently being challenged as an overreach in its own right. Add Section 232, running the entire time in the background. That's not a policy. That's a drawer full of keys nobody remembered cutting. Worth noting how fast the next challenge arrived. Hours after the Section 301 tariffs took effect on July 24, 2 small businesses, a New York spice retailer and a California watch retailer, filed suit in the U.S. Court of International Trade challenging that authority too. Footnote 14. The newest key in the drawer was already being tested before the week was out. The instinct is to assume the rest of the world is retaliating. Mostly it isn't. It's repositioning, and the sharpest example inverts the expected story entirely. On January 1, 2026, Mexico's Congress imposed tariffs of up to 50%, its legal ceiling under its own WTO commitments, on autos, textiles and other goods from countries without a Mexican free trade agreement. China, India, Brazil, South Korea, and others. Footnote 15. This wasn't retaliation against the United States. It was the opposite. The move followed months of direct pressure from Washington, floated openly as a Fortress North America strategy that U.S. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent welcomed by name, aimed at closing off Mexico as a backdoor route for Chinese goods into the U.S. market under USMCA. Footnote 16. When China's Commerce Ministry objected, President Claudia Sheinbaum's own response was direct. The measures, she said, are not aimed at you. Footnote 17. The timing isn't incidental either. Mexico and the U.S. formally opened bilateral USMCA review talks in March, the same month USTR's own forced labor investigations were getting underway. Footnote 18. Mexico didn't get caught in America's tariff fight. It joined it on the same side, aimed at a third country. The European Union tells a more messy story. In July 2025, Brussels and Washington struck a framework, a flat 15% U.S. tariff ceiling on most EU goods, no stacking on top of it, in exchange for the EU eliminating its own tariffs on U.S. industrial goods and committing to $750 billion in U.S. energy purchases plus $600 billion in new U.S. investment by 2028. Footnote 19. It took until this year to actually implement. A provisional agreement in May, parliamentary approval in June, and entry into force on July 1, 2026. Footnote 20. The European Commission's own framing calls this restoring stability and predictability. Contemporaneous coverage at signing described the same deal as imbalanced, favoring American interests, over EU objections. Footnote 21. Both characterizations are on the record. Which one ages better is a live question, not a settled one, and this show has no interest in pretending otherwise. Here's the mechanism connecting all of it back to Section 1, and it's the kind of thing almost nobody explaining this story on video actually names. Every WTO member has a bound tariff ceiling it's legally committed never to exceed, and an applied rate, what it actually charges, that's often well below that ceiling. The gap is sometimes called tariff water. Mexico's 50% auto tariff wasn't a new legal tool. It was Mexico simply moving its applied rate up to a ceiling it had already negotiated years ago. The United States doesn't have that option or not much of it. Size puts America's own average tariff water at roughly 1.8 percentage points, the gap between a 3.4% bound average and a 1.6% applied one. Footnote 22. That's the real reason this episode exists at all. Washington couldn't just dial up its applied rate within its own WTO commitments the way Mexico did. It had almost no water to work with, which is exactly why it needed the drawer full of statutes from Section 1 instead. Worth noting briefly without turning this into the full accounting, not every economy on the Section 301 list got the same treatment. Brazil is facing a second, separate Section 301 investigation over digital trade, intellectual property, and deforestation, proposing an additional 25% tariff that appears intended to stack directly on top of its 12.5% forced labor rate, for a potential combined rate of 37.5%. Footnote 22. And a further Section 301 excess capacity investigation covering 16 economies, including China, the EU, and Japan, remains open and unresolved as of this session. A probe clearly aimed at industrial overcapacity, and given this show's own coverage of China's overcapacity problem last episode, one worth watching closely rather than assuming it fizzles. Footnote 24. Whether China, Japan, the UK, and the rest of the covered economies respond with counter-tariffs of their own, rather than simply absorbing the hit the way the EU largely has, is a genuinely open question this episode doesn't answer, and it's the right opening question for whatever covers the rest of the world's response in full. The IMF's own read on where this leaves things, delivered the same week the Section 301 tariffs took effect. Global trade volume growth is projected to slow from 5% in 2025 to 3.5% in 2026, and outgoing IMF chief economist Pierre-Olivier Gourinchas put the systemic risk plainly. The risk is that we fall into a world of successive retaliatory actions, where countries constantly seek to exploit small advantages, but ultimately harm the overall system. Footnote 23. Mexico's alignment and the EU's grudging truce are both, so far, evidence against that scenario. Neither one closes the door on it. Every door has a locked room behind it. This one has several, and that's the point. Here's the actual shape of the problem. Congress has spent roughly a century handing the executive branch overlapping, differently shaped tariff authorities. A Depression-era discrimination provision here, a 1970s emergency powers statute there, a Cold War-era national security clause, a forced labor enforcement mechanism layered on top more recently, each written to solve a specific, narrow problem at the time, none of them repealed once the problem passed. Nobody designed this as a system. It accumulated, statute by statute, decade by decade, the way a junk drawer accumulates keys to houses nobody lives in anymore. That's what makes this locked room genuinely different from the last one this show covered. Episode 15's Boomerang was a dial with exactly two settings, both bad. This is something else entirely. A door with an unknown, possibly still uncounted number of spare keys, discovered one at a time, precisely when the key in current use stops working. Losing the IEPA key didn't require inventing a new lock. It required someone opening a drawer that had been sitting there since 1930, mostly forgotten, and trying whatever was in it. Congress could close this permanently, in theory, narrow or consolidate the executive branch's delegated trade authority into something a single court ruling could actually foreclose. Nothing procedurally stops that. But doing so would mean the legislative branch voluntarily giving up power it has spent decades not using and, more importantly, not particularly wanting to be responsible for. Tariff decisions are politically costly, and every administration since at least the 1970s has preferred an executive branch willing to make that call rather than reclaiming the job itself. Section 338 sat and used for 96 years not because nobody in Washington remembered it existed, but because using it was never worth the political exposure, until, this July, it suddenly was. The room isn't locked because someone built a wall. It's locked because the key ring has more keys on it than the surrounding fence has locks, and every time one gets confiscated, there's another one already cut. Step back from the individual statutes and look at what 5 months of this actually produces for the people who have to plan around it. Not certainty in either direction, just volatility with no fixed endpoint. A company sourcing from Canada has to price in a 50% tariff that didn't exist a month ago, built on a provision untested in modern courts, with real litigation risk hanging over whether Section 338 even survives its first legal challenge. A company sourcing from any of 60 other countries has to price in a forced labor compliance finding it may have had no meaningful opportunity to contest before the tariff landed. Footnote 11. Uncertainty of this kind doesn't just cost money on the specific tariffs, it costs money in every investment decision made in the shadow of not knowing which statute gets reached for next. And that uncertainty is exactly what's pushing other governments towards something this show has only gestured at so far: routing around Washington rather than through it. Trade agreements between major economies that don't include the United States at all, bilateral and regional deals among exactly the countries currently absorbing this tariff whiplash, aren't hypothetical anymore. They're a live, ongoing reconfiguration of who trades with whom, on whose terms, increasingly without waiting for American policy to hold still long enough to plan around. Whether that reconfiguration adds up to genuine fragmentation of the post-war trade system, or just a more multipolar version of the same one, is a real question, and it's a different question from anything covered in this episode. It's the next one. For statutes, one struck down by the country's highest court, and the same basic policy standing 5 months later anyway, not because the ruling failed but because the ruling was never actually big enough to reach everything holding the policy up. That's worth sitting with the next time someone tells you a Supreme Court decision ended a tariff fight. It ended one key. The ring had more on it. Next time, what the rest of the world is actually building while Washington keeps finding new drawers to open.